Almost everything built by human hands has a purpose. And once that purpose has expired, it's no longer required. It's true of your old mobile phone. It's true of your old car. And it's true of entire buildings. Not everything that's abandoned gets thrown away or forgotten, though. There are some awe-inspiring abandoned places and objects all over the world, standing as monuments to times that have long passed. And we've put some of the most striking examples together for you in this video. Fort Alexander in Russia was initially built to house soldiers. Since it stopped doing that, it's also been used to accommodate scientists and partygoers attending illegal raves. The fort was built in the Gulf of Finland during the mid-19th century and was once seen as a vital defense position to guard the country against invasion via the Baltic Sea. Instead of being built on land, it sits on beams that have been driven directly into the seabed like a house on stilts. It's so enormous that you could almost classify it as an artificial island, large enough to host 1,000 soldiers with space for a communal courtyard in its center, with spaces around the perimeter for 100 guns and cannons to be mounted. Given that it was so heavily defended, it's probably unsurprising that it was never attacked. By 1900, its importance as a defensive position had waned, so plague research was carried out there instead. That lasted until the 1980s, after which it's mostly been abandoned, save for the occasional illegal rave party. Tarakhanov Fort is a real wonder to look at, crumbling to pieces on one side but almost perfectly preserved on the other. The site of the fortress is within the borders of what's now Ukraine, but when it's built, it was the precise point where the Russian border met the edge of the Austrian Empire back in 1890. Although it's called a fort, it would probably be more accurate to describe it as a castle. It's a vast site and it's surrounded by a moat. The fort saw action during both of the world wars during the 20th century, but was unfortunately captured by the German side during the second of those wars. Local legends say that the Nazis tested experimental chemical weapons within its walls, using local citizens as subjects. It's impossible to prove those stories now. When the Germans were eventually forced out of the fort, they filled up some of the lower levels with concrete. That made the fort useless for strategic purposes, so it's been abandoned ever since. But it's still popular with urban explorers. Not every site you'll see in this video will be a fort, but we're going to continue with the theme for a little while longer because this is Oblistiki, which translates into English as the Fortress of the Lord. It's bigger than a fort, though. It's a whole town made out of rock. You'll find it in eastern Georgia, where it played a vital role in the nation's history. The first people to settle at the site of this fort did so approximately 3,000 years ago, and it was still populated until somewhere around the 13th century. For the 500 years between 600 and 1100, it was the heart of Kartli, the quasi-state that would eventually go on to become Georgia. Carvings in the rock and artifacts dug out of the ground prove that sun worship happened at the site, so it's likely that it was abandoned when Christianity arrived in Georgia and Tbilisi became a more important city. The Mongol conquest of the 13th century would have finished off any of the stragglers who decided to stay, and since then the entire 120,000 square foot site has been empty. The Cape May bunker in New Jersey was built in 1942 and has been standing there ever since. Even though the war it was built for has been over for more than 70 years, it will last for a few years more, but probably not another 70. Erosion of the sand and shore beneath the bunker has brought the shoreline right up to its main entrance, and eventually it will be carried out piece by the tide. When that happens, it'll be a case of nature completing a demolition job that's long overdue. The bunker was supposed to be dismantled when the war came to an end. It's just that nobody ever got around to doing it. Perhaps the difficulty of the task is what put them off. It's an enormous hulk of a structure with concrete walls 7 feet thick, standing on top of wooden pilings that have somehow borne the weight of the behemoth for all of these decades. It's part of the New Jersey landscape now. The old train yard in Budapest, Hungary has the official name Istvántelek, but that doesn't capture the imagination like its nickname does, the Red Star Train Graveyard. There are more than 100 old locomotives, carriages, engines, and complete trains at the site. Some of them are hidden away in rickety old depots, and others are just standing in the field, rotting away in the open air. Nobody knows for sure, but there are rumors that at least a few of these old trains have a grisly history. They were used to transport Jewish prisoners to the Auschwitz concentration camp during wartime. The yard dates back to the early 20th century when it was imagined as an enormous repair yard for the entire country's fleet of trains. The plan didn't quite work out though, and now the only working repair yard at the site is a tiny portion towards its south. Everything else is abandoned and slowly falling to pieces. Train enthusiasts might be interested to know that there are some extremely rare models here, including the Hungarian MAV 424 steam engine and a MAV 301. There are many private zoos in the United States of America, here and now, but the very first one was Catskill Game Farm, which opened in the 1930s. Sadly, as you may have guessed because of its inclusion on this list, it's no longer open. It is, however, still standing, and we have plenty of great images to show you from the site. Catskill is a small mountain town in New York, but during the busiest years of the zoo's operations, it attracted over 500,000 visitors each year. Those numbers had dwindled by the turn of the century, and in 2006, the zoo had to face the economic reality that it was no longer making money, so it had to close. Amazingly, the original owner, Roland Lindemann, only intended it to be a place to amuse himself and his friends, and initially didn't charge people to come and look at his collection of goats, donkeys, and deer. As visitor numbers increased, he realized he was onto a potential new career, and the zoo grew from there. It's thought that new owners may soon reopen the site, which has tentatively been renamed as the Old Game Farm. Heading to the water cooler to get a drink of water in a plastic or cardboard cup might be a process that happens in every office in the world nowadays. But it all started with the American Water Company of New England in 1908, who went on to invent the Dixie Cup. This crumbling warehouse was the center of their business empire after the original business expanded and changed names, becoming the Individual Drinking Cup Company, the Heath Cup Company, and finally Dixie Cup in 1919, which came at a bargain price of $3,000 per acre. The famous giant Dixie Cup on the roof was used as an emergency water tower during 1955 in the aftermath of the Hurricane Diane emergency. It's even said that pilots used the cup as a navigational aid because it was illuminated at night. By 1980, the warehouse and factory had become outdated, and so it was sold to investors. Since then, nothing has been done with it. There are plans to turn it into apartments and office space, but asbestos and underground tanks at the site are believed to be likely to make that process difficult. Religious faith can drive people to do incredible things, as the existence of the church in Zalezo, Poland proves. It was built in 1796 by Karl Gottard Langens, a man of strong Protestant belief, but no architectural experience other than which he'd taught himself. His lack of expertise might show on the outside of the building, which is nothing special to look at, but the interior is a work of elliptical beauty. Made of Bolesław sandstone, the church is approximately 60 feet wide and 90 feet tall. Local residents loved it so much that they nicknamed it the Pearl of Zalezo and continued to worship inside it for 150 years. The Second World War spelled the end of days for the use of the church as a center of worship, not because it was bombed, but because after the war the village became part of Poland and the German worshippers retreated to the new German border. Since then, it's been looted and vandalized and even briefly used as a sheep pen, and yet still some of the old beauty remains. If you go to visit the Cornwall Iron Mine just east of Lake Superior in the United States, you'll be visiting a place that can boast more than 2 centuries of mining superiority. When Peter Grubb founded it in 1739, he did so because he just located the most significant deposit of iron anywhere within the United States of America. It was considered such a vital American asset that President George Washington once traveled to inspect it with his own eyes. Initially, the mine's job was to provide iron ore for the nearby Cornwall Iron Furnace, but the furnace closed in 1883. Undeterred, operations at the mine continued for almost a century beyond that. They finally came to a halt in 1972 when the site was flooded in the aftermath of Hurricane Agnes. It was technically feasible to pump the floodwater out of the tunnels, but it was decided that doing so wouldn't be cost-effective. The site has stood silent ever since, although we hear there are now plans to turn it into a water park and thereby make it into a tourist attraction. It took longer to build the fortress city of Fatehpur Sikri in India than it was in use for. That's not because it took a particularly long time to build, it's because that, having gone to so much trouble to make the incredible city, it was occupied and used for less than 1 year after it was finished. Akbar, emperor of the Mughal Empire, personally ordered the construction of the city and took a personal interest in every stage of its design, designating it as the capital of his empire as early as 1571, even though barely a tenth of it was completed by that point. By 1585, it was finally complete just as the emperor wanted it, and that's when it became abandoned. This was a tragic waste of the quirky outdoor board game, the Grand Mosque, the palatial courts, and the multicultural and multi-faith architecture which drew on Islamic, Christian, Hindu, and Zoroastrian beliefs and ideas. It was nature that made the site non-viable. The same year it was completed, the lake that it depended on for water dried up, and therefore life at the location couldn't be sustained. The British Army did extensive damage to the buildings while using them as a barracks during the invasion of India, but what's left is now acknowledged as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Sudiagan House was once claimed to be the tallest single-family wooden house in the world. It's a strange claim to fame, but the man who built it was quite an eccentric man. His name was Nikolai Petrovich Sudiagan, and when reporters asked him why he was building the odd property in Arkhangelsk 1992, he answered that he was doing it purely because he could. Sudiagan's structure was a 145-foot-tall home with 13 stories. He got all the framework completed but never quite managed to finish off the interior. We think he probably got distracted. His original plan was just to build a 2-story regular home, but he fell in love with the Japanese vernacular design process and carried on building upward. He turned it into a 5-story building, but then started thinking he'd made an ugly mushroom, so he added even more height. Sudiagan never got to move into his home. He spent a few years in prison in the early 21st century, and without his attention, the structure deteriorated badly. By 2008, local authorities considered it to be a fire risk and condemned it. They were right to be worried. Fire destroyed almost the entire building in 2012. We don't talk about the 1936 Olympic Games very much. That's because they were held in Berlin, Germany during Hitler's time in charge of the country. That earned them the nickname the Nazi Olympics, and they're seldom mentioned in Germany. That means that many Germans don't even know that the Olympic Village built for the event still exists. But it does. For the time it was made, it would have been an impressive technological achievement, with stunning dormitories, training pools, restaurants, and dining areas. The design was based on an idealized German village and was intended to portray to the world the idea of a peaceful Germany that had no interest in war. That was a little ironic, given that the military built it and it was the military who used it after the Olympics were over. When the Second World War ended, it was the turn of the Soviet Army to use the old Olympic Village as a barracks, and they carried on doing so until 1994, by which point the USSR had collapsed. It's now largely been forgotten, although the continuing growth of Berlin's population means that residential homes may eventually have to be built on the site. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.